Good afternoon and welcome to Capital Account. Happy Friday. I'm Lauren Lister here in Washington, D.C. The U.S. unemployment rate dropped to 8.3% for January. Naturally, it was cheered and a good photo op for the U.S. President Barack Obama to say the economy is improving. But
these numbers will go up and down in the coming months. And there's still far too many Americans who need a job or need a job that pays better than the one they have now.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more. In fact, a large chunk of those people who finally found work last month landed low-wage jobs. And yes, numbers will go up and down, but those that haven't been able to find work for more than 27 weeks, that's 6 months, well, that number isn't really moving. It's stuck at 5.5 million. Youth unemployment is stuck at 23%. There's more. Don't worry, we'll break it all down. Speaking of work, say happy birthday to the U.S. income tax as we hear rallying cries this presidential election season for raising taxes in the U.S. We have a different message for Washington. Stop stealing from us before you even think about asking for more of our hard-earned cash. How about start by getting this Stock Act done to try to curb insider trading in the halls of Congress? We'll have a little more advice to share. But also, we've heard time and time again, we've heard it from U.S. Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul.
It's time we not only audit the Federal Reserve, but also in due time get rid of the Federal Reserve.
And the Fed. We've seen a growing number of people get on board with his calls. We've heard people say, hey, that's just crazy talk. Luckily, author Jeffery Tucker is here to break down how exactly the economy would work without a central bank. Very exciting. Let's get to today's Capital Account. So people are pretty optimistic about these new U.S. jobs numbers that came out showing unemployment ticked down 0.2 percentage points to 8.3%, lowest in 3 years. But as even U.S. President Barack Obama said, these numbers will go up and down. So I want to take a look at the bigger picture and some of the downside of this report. Lucky for you, I've got some numbers to throw up. So the long-term unemployed, that's longer than 6 months, was very little changed at 5.5 million. The stunner for me, that accounts for 42.9% of the unemployed. That's a big number. Now, the number of people employed part-time for economic reasons, that was little change. That's 8.2 million. Now, these are people who were working part-time, not because they want to take some time off, but because their hours have been cut back or because they're unable to find a full-time job. Youth unemployment among 16 to 19-year-olds, that's 23%. That's stuck there. And per Bloomberg, about 113,000 of the 243,000 jobs added are low-wage jobs. That's according to a strategist at CRT Capital Group. So, given all of this, there are some proposals, some solutions to tackling the U.S. economic problems. Some seem like they're really just aimed at the symptoms, though, of a sick economy. Throwing money at the problem, you could say. No pun intended. Then there are some who want to perform surgery. We've heard Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul, for one, call to end the Fed.
You can't print papers of money in secrecy by the Federal Reserve and pretend it's a creation of wealth. We have gotten the attention of the American people dealing with our monetary system and the Federal Reserve, and it's time we not only audit the Federal Reserve, but also in due time get rid of the Federal Reserve.
And then there are some people that say, come on, that's insanity. You can't really end the Fed. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how this would actually work. We criticize the Fed a lot, but I want to know how we could really unwind it. It's been around for a while now. So Jeffery Tucker is here. Lucky for us, in studio. He's executive editor of Laissez-Faire Books, contributor to The Daily Reckoning, also author of this book, It's a Jetsons World, Private Miracles and Public Crimes, which I luckily have a copy of right here and cannot wait to read. But first, I want to welcome you to the studio. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I want to get to the jobs numbers because, yes, those are big news today. But as I said, there are some solutions in light of these economic problems that seem like Band-Aids. And then there are some that seem like open heart surgery. that you don't know where it's going to go. And one would be this argument to end the Fed. We've heard it from Ron Paul. We've seen protests, Occupy the Fed protests in the U.S. We've seen them in Europe at the ECB. First, before we get to how to get rid of it, what's your case against the Fed?
Well, I think it's very interesting. We live in a country where we pretend that we love capitalism, we love the free market, we love free enterprise, and yet we have this central planning apparatus that's running our money and banking system. We've only had it for 100 years. All throughout the 19th century, there were debates. Should we have a national bank or not? And typically it was the mercantilists, the statists, the nationalists, the people that wanted to grow government and have a kind of a 19th century version of big government programs. We always loved the central bank. But we didn't have one. But banking was getting ever more centralized, and every time they made it bigger, more problems came about. And finally, in 1913, they created a central bank. And look what's happened ever since. You know, the dollar is now worth less than a nickel of what it was at the beginning of the outset of the Fed. Business cycles have gotten worse. We're more in debt. The moral hazard associated with the financial system is just growing worse and worse. And we're making our problems even worse now. All of Bernanke's so-called solutions are actually just forestalling the worst problems down the line. And that's why I think if we end the Fed right now, I mean, Ron Paul is exactly right. The only thing I would take out is a qualifier. He says, in due time, we'll do this. Nah, do it today.
You say do it today.
We don't need it. Look, as long as this thing is around, they're going to use it. It's like if you got a doctor who's poisoning the patient, you got to fire the guy.
Okay.
And that's what I think we're dealing with.
You don't slowly wean the patient off that poison. You got to cut it off cold turkey.
No, you got to, because they're going to keep pursuing the wrong solutions. Look, everybody more or less agrees that the problems of the housing bubble that we just went through were created by the low interest rate policies of the Fed during the 2000s, and that they created this problem, at least contributed substantially to it. So what do we do now? We got Bernanke reducing interest rates to zero?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like contrary to natural law. It's insane. I mean, we've had positive interest rates since the beginning of human history, and now this guy shows up and says, oh, we don't need interest rates. Let's get rid of them.
And it's funny when you look at the federal funds rate, after every recession since 1980, they've gotten lower and lower and lower until there's literally nowhere to go. But, Jeffrey Tucker, let's really break this down because, yes, there's a case against the Fed. I hear it. You say it's only been around for 100 years, but it's been around for 100 years. And this economy, we've seen financial services grow as a huge chunk of it. How do you realistically unwind that at this point, and what's the impact on the economy?
Well, the first thing we have to do is we've got to have the hands off the yield curve. And, you know, everybody these days thinks that the Fed controls interest rates. Well, look, interest rates are part of a free market economy. It's a kind of a price of time. It's something, it's like a price of shoes or a price of potatoes or anything else. There's a price attached to it. If we'd let it free up, it would just happen on its own. Yes, interest rates would rise. That would be very good in many ways.
But that's what I want to ask you. If we just ended the Fed right now, wouldn't interest rates just, I mean, even when we mentioned ending the Fed, wouldn't they just shoot up to, what, 12%, and we'd have massive defaults, massive foreclosures, massive unemployment, and a depression?
I don't know about the unemployment and the depression part, but the thing is that, first of all, high interest rates would be good for savers right now. And savers need a break. They're being looted every day. I mean,
and I couldn't agree more, but what would be the damage? Let's be honest. What would the damage be if all of a sudden interest rates shot up to 12%? Wouldn't we have massive foreclosures, massive people cast out on the streets? I mean, I just don't see how it would
labor
be
markets tend to be, if we can loosen up some labor restrictions like minimum wages and union regulations, stuff like that, we'd free up the labor markets too, and the resources would go to where they're most valued, labor resources. Nobody wants to work in a job in a boom economy. You're going to get fired eventually anyway because that stuff's unsustainable. So I don't believe in sustaining unsustainable booms. So if we let the market take care of it, then we'd see some reality. We're living in a very distorted world right now. We don't really even know what these numbers mean. We don't know if the banks are really solvent. They're holding all these assets that are mispriced. Everything's kind of chaotic. I mean, we're flying blind right now. I mean, you're going through these unemployment numbers. We don't really even know what those things mean. You know,
it's a good point.
The distortions introduced by the Federal Reserve. It's a massively distorted banking structure. The banking system's broken right now. I mean, banks are no longer doing what they once did. I mean, they can't make money.
I mean, you don't even know
loans.
when you say now, what does a bank do? You don't even know the answer to that. But Jeffrey, we interviewed here, Dimitri did, the former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Blinder, and he asked them about this issue of setting interest rates. I first want to play you what he said about the Fed's ability to properly forecast the economy and know where interest rates are. Let's take a listen to that.
It would be a better world if the people at the Federal Reserve had perfect foresight and had a perfect model of how the economy works so they knew exactly what to do at exactly what moment. That's a fantasy. Now, what it means...
Okay, so he kind of admitted that the Fed doesn't really exactly know where interest rates are supposed to be. If the Fed doesn't know, how do we know that the market would know, and how does the market set them?
Well, the market does everything through a decentralized way. It gathers information from every individual actor, according to the buying and selling decisions of individuals. And as F.A. Hayek explained the process, this generates a greater knowledge than any individual has. Right now we have this, I don't know if you've read those transcripts from the FMOC that came out recently from 2006, but you know, the Fed is a dysfunctional corporation. I mean, it is just crazy. I mean, it's like a comic routine reading these guys.
Okay, well, that's what I want to ask. So in a more nefarious way, I guess, part of the reason the Fed was created was because of public opinion that was against a private banking cartel. Has the Fed solved that, or do we now have a public-private cartel?
Yeah, that's really what happened. I mean, eventually the government basically nationalized the banking system in cooperation with the banks. And, you know, there are now two sides to the debate. The Republicans more or less want the Fed to be controlled by the big banks and big corporations, and the Democrats want to turn it over to Congress. And I'm just saying there's a third option. Let's just, you know, we don't need a nationalized banking system. You know, let's go back to a free market. And by the way, I would go even further and say that we not just need free banking, but we should consider private production of money.
I've heard arguments
in
for that.
the beginning of the years of the Industrial Revolution, people made their own money, and it worked beautifully. And it can happen again today, especially in the digital world.
Digital money.
Yeah, digital money. And, you know, it's more and more common. You see these attempts.
Yeah.
Since the Internet opened its doors, we've seen more and more attempts to try to create digital currencies. We should give it a try. And, in fact, this is Ron Paul's suggestion.
That's an idea. That's an idea. Let me ask you this, though. You said the Fed's only been around for 100 years. There were times where it was done just fine without one. But I want to go back to this interview with Alan Blinder, because one of the things Dimitri asked him was if the period between the Second Bank of the U.S. and the Civil War wasn't an example of the market being able to set interest rates, and it was called the wildcat banking. Here's what Alan Blinder said.
Maybe the best way to answer this is that we didn't call it the wildcat banking era for nothing. Wildcats are wild, and they sometimes produce very dysfunctional results, and they did.
So, Mr. Jeffrey Tucker, Mr. Whiskey and Gunpowder, are wildcats still as wild as they once were, if not wilder?
In defense of wildcat banking, at least they produced local problems that were solved locally. Now we have national and international problems that are solved on this internet. They're never solved.
Well, because no one can agree.
Yeah, the wildcats would be far preferred, and we have to look at what caused those wildcat banking things. At least they went bankrupt. You know, I mean, this is part of the free market is that you not only make profits, make losses too. So we need a system where banks can and do go belly up. Bankruptcy can be a sign of a healthy, functioning, progressing economy. But those
although there are a lot of consequences. Well, it hurts.
Yeah, but at least you have competition.
It hurts to heal when you're really sick. Sometimes you have to have painful surgeries.
Right. But at least if you have competition, you have a kind of working towards excellence in service of the customer, you know, over time. And markets are never a straight move forward all the time. But, you know, the wildcat banking was also very much influenced at the time by all these kind of railroad rackets that were going on, and, you know, these little mini explosions and booms. The bankers even back then were working with the politicians, you know, trying to...
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And what went on and what led to the creation of the Fed is that the banking system evermore wanted to kind of have a puffy life where everything was perfect, where they were protected from market forces.
Well, that still happens. But Jeffrey Tucker, before we go to break really quickly, we know it's a confidence game these days. That is, I mean, a huge part of it all. How do we know that everything, the financial system, wouldn't just collapse once everybody knew that we were ending the Fed?
I don't believe this. I don't believe this. You know, everybody warned about this at 2008, that, oh, we've got to have this gigantic trillions of dollars of bailouts and everything. It's all propaganda. You know, we would go through a little bit of a tough time. It would be tricky, but the market, it does amazing things every day for us, you know, from giving us groceries and digital media and iPhones and, you know, everything you can name. Oil from the bottom of the sea to your gas station. I think the market can handle money and banking just fine. We just have to let it have a chance to do
All
so.
right. Well, we have to go to break quickly. When we come back, I want to hear your song. If you can give us a preview. He's got a Fed song. We'll have more with Jeffrey Tucker, so stick around. And still ahead, say happy birthday to the income tax and write your wish list for what you'd like government to give up before they talk about raising it. We will after the break. But first, your closing market numbers.
put a picture of me when I was like 9 years old on To Tell the Truth.
I have a confession. I am a total ghetto princess. I love rap and hip-hop music and Christian music.
I thought he was kind of a dick yesterday.
I'm very proud of the role that Al Jazeera has played.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Tom Hartman. Welcome to The Big Picture.
What drives the world?
The fear-mongering used by politicians.
Who makes decisions?
Considerable breakthrough has already been made.
Who can you trust?
No one who is imbued with a global missionary zeal.
Where are we heading?
State-controlled capitalism is called fascism.
When nobody dares to ask, we do. RT, question more.
Welcome back to Capital Account. Let's get straight to it because Jeffrey Tucker is in studio. It is the birthday of the income tax, and I think he has a birthday wish for it. He's author of that book you see there, Jetsons World, Private Miracles and Public Crimes. So, Jeffrey Tucker, it's the birthday of the income tax, started and ratified in 1913. Now we hear this discussion around this presidential election about raising taxes. We have an idea at Capital Account. Before you even talk about raising taxes for any of us, you got to sacrifice there at Washington. You hear that? You need to cut the waste, fraud, and abuse. You need to eliminate all of this stealing. One good start would be this act that's supposed to curb insider trading. Can we bring up that comic really quickly? Okay, so this we love. Dad, I'm considering a career in organized crime. The dad says government or private sector. I mean, that kind of sums up what we're saying. What do you think? It's not fair for you to ask us to sacrifice more, Washington, until you get it together.
Well, that's been true for a very long time, a couple hundred years, actually. So another bad thing, we've been talking about the Fed, but in 1913, they created this income tax. It was a 1% tax that applied to 1%.
I know that, yeah. William Jennings Bryan was a big part of it. It was actually a tax on the rich.
Yes, it was. And it was an attempt to kind of displace the tariff at the time. And that's why a lot of people favored it, especially in the South and the West, because it was supposed to replace the tariff. And they thought, well, let's just tax those northern industrial guys and we'll get Washington off our back. But eventually, look what happened. I mean, it's eluding us every day, not just to the income tax, but the payroll tax, which for a lot of people is a much larger portion of the tax burden than the income tax itself.
So, and you're opposed to the income tax entirely?
Yeah, and there's a philosophical reason, because there's a presumption behind the income tax that the government owns your income and can take whatever it wants, and whatever they leave you is just sort of a favor they give you. Well, this runs contrary to everything that classical liberalism ever taught. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, in his inaugural address in 1800, when he became 1801, when he became president, said that the worker deserves the fruit of his labor, and that should never be touched by government.
And I hear you, but then how do you pay for basic services that we can all agree should be around for people? I mean, we do have a social contract. We don't live in the jungle. I don't believe that there shouldn't be a basic safety net of some kind. How do we pay for that without an income tax?
Well, the presumption in the 19th century was that the tariff was going to cover us, and if you drive and high tariffs drive people crazy. So if you have high tariffs, then there's political pressure to lower them, and we can keep them as low as possible. And frankly, government's just going to have to cut back.
So you think just get rid of the income tax and cut back government?
Yeah, you have to just get rid of the whole thing. And look, what a wonderful thing that would be. Imagine, you make money, you keep the money. That's the kind of system we need to have.
Well, I hear you, but at the same time, I want to make my money and keep my money, but if I suddenly got unemployed and there was literally nowhere for me to turn and I was cast out and I had nothing to do, I would want some kind of unemployment insurance benefits that, everybody had agreed were a good thing.
Well, if we're talking about insurance, insurance is a private industry that could probably be provided privately. There's probably plenty of programs that would emerge. A lot of times government does things and they displace the private sector. If the government would stop doing it, we'd see the private sector rush in and take care of whatever we need.
What proof is there of that? Give me some evidence.
All of human history, I would say. Really, I mean, once you start looking at it,
during the Great Depression, though, people, that's what brought about these programs. People died and starved and
well, the Great Depression
lined up for bread.
In the first place, the Great Depression was caused by the government and prolonged by the government. So the taxes, the Fed, all that nonsense, all the crazy unemployment programs, everything, made everything worse. And they're doing the same thing today. Look at those unemployment numbers among young people.
Yeah.
This is catastrophic.
Yeah.
And you know what it is?
Well, wait, let's talk about why, because some of the biggest things to come out of that report today, people are glowing about it, but that youth unemployment, 16 to 19-year-olds, 23% stuck there. We're almost out of time. Why is that so significant?
Well, it's significant because we're sacrificing a whole generation, and they are not learning to work. They're not learning how to enter the marketplace and enter the commercial world, and this is terrible for their habits of mind, for their training, and everything else. And it's caused directly in this case by a series of government regulations. Really, I think the child labor laws are preposterous. They are. Now, listen, I'm going to talk about children. I'm talking about young teenagers can't get jobs. We've got young people, 13, 14, 15, who want to work, and they can't. I mean, because of these ridiculous regulations. And look at the minimum wage. It's been increasing more dramatically over the last decade than any period in the previous 50 years. And this is a limit. It's a violation of human rights. It says to young people, you cannot work.
Well, then what? Get rid of child labor laws, and what? You have 5-year-olds being forced to work.
we have 13-year-olds working in grocery stores. That's a great start.
Okay, well, that's a whole other conversation. We'll have to leave it at that. We didn't get to hear your song.
My song.
But
song is good.
Your song is good. Lucky for us, we are going to see your debate tonight with Dean Baker, and we will film your song, and it gives everybody something to look forward to because you will hear it. Jeffrey Tucker about the Fed. All right, it's Friday, and it's been a while since I've been able to respond to you, though I do on Twitter quite regularly, but I want to do a more formal response. We received one long, scathing email of criticism. I can't read the whole email, but I did want to respond to a few pieces. M. Mazzy emailed and said, Alona has repeatedly had Anthony Randazzo on her show as an economic expert. It drives me nuts. He views things the same as Lauren Lister through the same lens as a Wall Street broker. It makes me crazy because every time I see him, I hear him complain about the government keeping the interest low. Lauren Lister has made the same argument. Now, I can't speak for Anthony Randazzo, but maybe, we'll get a chance to hear from him. But as for me, first, if this person thinks I see things through the same lens as a Wall Street broker, then I don't know how much she's seen of the show, because I don't think you hear Wall Street complaining too much about low interest rates. You see them benefiting from them. And all we do on this show is analyze what's wrong with Wall Street. So, to go on, let's get more specific. As Lister has done, they lament the fact that they are not making money from interest being low. For God's sake, we're in the middle of a housing crisis. There are probably millions of us who are making our mortgage payments on time who will foreclose when rates go up if we are not able to stabilize these loans when interest rates are kept artificially low. To sustain these loans. So, our argument, this is something we talk about all the time, okay? The savers. When interest rates are kept artificially low, it directly punishes savers. Borrowers, on the other hand, unless they are large financial institutions, do not necessarily benefit from these low rates. We haven't really seen that. Banks still have to be willing to lend you money. And what we've seen is that banks are more concerned about padding their balance sheets than they are in extending credit to mom and pop. In other words, the Fed can lower the federal funds rate all it wants. It can keep it at zero, as it's done and will do, but this does not mean that you're going to get an affordable rate on your mortgage. In fact, as we've seen, mortgage rates are still out of reach for many people despite the easy money policies of the Fed. To go on, she says a number of people have been talking publicly about reducing principal and canceling debt. It really does make sense. Of course, the banks are not going to want to do it, but we should be as bold as a country and force them into a new paradigm. We agree. This is something we talk about all the time. Debt forgiveness or default. There is a point at which debt levels become so large that they begin to eat into economic growth as opposed to promoting it. This is where we are today. So we hear you on that. Now, she also said a few things about how I make a lot of money and probably have no problem paying my mortgage. which, if you know anything about journalism, is kind of laughable. I don't have a mortgage, don't know when I will, but I know plenty of people personally who are struggling very much during these times. So I don't want you to take my position as unsympathetic towards yours, Ms. Mazzy, I believe. But I did want to address your email and the criticism, because we'll continue to talk about this issue of savers and interest rates, sticking to interest rates. Let's go to Twitter, because I got into a bit of a back and forth that I really didn't have time to respond to. It was during Davos. Things were busy. It was chasing people. Mark Dow tweeted that the data tells us unambiguously the Fed is debasing the dollar assertion is wrong, to which I replied, well, it's sure debasing my savings account. He tweeted back and said, how do you measure, if we could advance that, how do you measure the extent to which government is debasing your savings? I didn't get a chance to respond. I measure it by the fact, though, Mark, that interest rates are lower than the cost of living, so I'm losing money if it's sitting in savings, financial repression. Now, this sparked more responses on Twitter, the conversation me and Mark had from other people. Mark said it's hard to argue about debasement if the U.S. dollar is slightly stronger since printing started. Hedge Fund Invest said that's more a testament to other currencies just doing worse as a reflection of economies. And what he's getting at is that the dollar's traded relative to other currencies. Here's Mohammed El-Arian, CEO of PIMCO, explaining to me the dollar's relative strength.
Exchange rates are very different because they are relative price. So it's the dollar versus the euro. It's the dollar versus the yen. So when you look at exchange rates, you have to ask the relative question, not what does it look like on a standalone basis, but what does it look like relative to other exchange rates.
Cleanest dirty shirt, to use their analogy. What matters is not how many Zimbabwe dollars I can buy with my U.S. dollars. What matters is how much of the stuff I need to sustain my living standards. That's how you measure debasement. Moving on, I want to thank everyone for the positive responses to my Davos coverage, many of which I responded to on Twitter, and I just want to reassert that. Also, earlier this week, we got into a debate over savers versus speculators, and one of our guests brought up recent bank earnings as a sign that Fed policies and zero interest rates don't benefit banks. One of our YouTube viewers said this, newsflash, the bankers might not be living the high life like 10 years ago, but none of them are getting foreclosed on. They still make millions and billions, and we're gonna say, hey, it's okay, at least they are hurting too. Well, funny how lifelong investors like Jim Rogers and Mark Faber don't buy into this and make money honestly investing. I just want to make sure that you got a chance to catch my Jim Rogers interview where I asked him about this earlier this week. You can catch it online, because that is all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching the show. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Lauren Lister and give us feedback at youtube.com/Capital Account. Have a great weekend, and from everyone here at Capital Account, have a good night.